Welcome to another episode of Faithfully Podcast. In this episode, artist and activist Sho Baraka talks with Faithfully Magazine's associate editor, Timothy Isaiah Cho, about themes in his debut book, He Saw That It Was Good. Baraka discusses the importance of narratives, especially for Christians of color, how faith impacted his understanding of vocation, why he rejects Christian art that fails to reflect reality, why Christians should view work as worship, and much more. After listening to this episode, head to faithfullymagazine.com to read the transcript and watch video clips from this Q&A.
Can you talk a little bit about the backstory behind your book? What made you realize that this was a book that you needed to write? What did you want your readers to walk away with when they read this book?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me and taking the time out to interview me about the book. I think, as you may know, I come from people primarily know me as an artist, as a hip hop artist, to be more specific. And I think very similar to your first album, your first book is really just the culmination of your life and a collection of thoughts and experiences that you are excited about, I guess, sharing with the world. The first album I did, it was pretty much all these ideas and concepts that I had been thinking through for many, many years. And I was just happy that somebody was giving me an opportunity to make an album. And similarly with writing, I think that there's been things that I've spoken on in the past. There's been lectures I've given, interviews I've done, and experiences that I've had that I thought were either applicable or good, just anecdotes for people to wrestle with. And then there were just people I studied. And so at the end of the day, when I was approached about doing a book, it wasn't as daunting for me. The task in itself wasn't daunting because it's really just an outpouring of my life. Really, you're just trying to communicate. Here's the things that I felt have helped me. Here are the people, the movements, the ideas, and maybe if I can give you some of my own little spin to it, it could be a benefit for you as well. And so it was really just a lifelong collection of just of things and talks, lectures, ideas that I've been thinking through. And so now it was about being diligent and disciplined to sit down and actually make some sense, some cohesive sense of it, if that makes sense. And so,
yes. But
real quickly, the more interesting aspect of all of this is I've always wanted to write fiction, actually. And so my initial desire for my first book was to be a fiction book. And as you may know, the book has fiction in there. There are a series of short stories and that I just, I've thought through, but I've always wanted to write a novel. And so the pressure is the next book, just like the album creates expectations. People read it, and people listen to your music, and now there's expectations, and now you put pressure on yourself to either be as good or better than the last album. And same thing with this book. There's pressure to, once it releases and actually, and some of the masses get to consume it, the pressure is trying not to live in any kind of expectation that other people may have for you, but just to create excellence and to challenge yourself and being a thoughtful individual who can transmit good ideas.
Mm-hmm. When you were writing this book, was the audience the same audience, from your hip hop career? Like, was that the same audience you were thinking of? Were you thinking of a brand new audience or kind of a bit of both?
I think there's a lot of crossover, but yeah, I think the type of artist I am is similar to the type of writer and thinker I am. So, I would like to think that I'm thoughtful. I like to engage culture from areas of academia, social thought, creativity, complex ideas, and trying to make comprehensive, take complex ideas and make them comprehensive for the consumer. And I even think in my music, I'm a storyteller. I'm a storyteller. So I think there is a lot of crossover. However, I do also realize that there are a lot of people who love music who don't love reading. And so the tension that I have as someone who loves reading, not just, nonfiction, but fiction as well, is that I love the Toni Morrisons, I love the Flannery O'Connors, the C.S. Lewis's, the Hemingways. And when you look at those people as the North Star, the challenge is you swing for the fences, or you look at your work and you're like, this will never be as good as that, and you begin to have this ominous cloud that covers over you and follows you everywhere, and then there's a deep insecurity about who you are and how you write and how you create. And so in some ways you have to be able to shake the confidence that I developed as an artist. You have to figure out how to bring that over as a writer as well, even though you haven't developed the muscles quite as well as the writing for music. But that comes with repetition, that comes with affirmation, that comes with critique, that comes with challenge. But that also comes with ultimately finding your voice and knowing who you are, and to your question, who you're communicating to. I know the people who love Hemingway and C.S. Lewis may not be the audience that I'm reaching out to, because if I'm honest, there's still a large mass of hip hop listeners, and I mean true hip hop aficionados, who probably don't like nonfiction and musing the way that I write it. And so I'm trying to introduce this genre of writing and this mix of fiction and nonfiction to people who usually most likely consume their information through music or audible, like lectures and things of that nature. So yeah, I mean, it's the same audience, but there's some challenges and some people on the fringes you try to get.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Kind of the behind the scenes and internal processing of all that. That's really fascinating to see that. In your book, you talk about the importance of narratives and stories, and how stories shape our worlds. And I'd love to hear you talk on how, especially Christians of color, need to be able to recognize the stories that are told about us and also how they shape us. Why is that important for Christians of color, especially, to know?
Well, I think it's ultimately important because the Bible is just one. I think it's important to know that the Bible is a story. We often treat it like it's an academic book, or we treat it like it's like it's this lofty treaty that descended from heaven, right? But it's actually just a story. It's a story of God's redemption and his relationship with humanity, and how he's trying to reconcile all of that. And if people of color don't see themselves properly in that narrative, then we ultimately don't see God in the way that he truly is. We don't see humanity in the way that it truly is. And when people of color are omitted from the grand narrative of great contribution in the Christian faith, then ultimately they become individuals who've placed themselves in the margin, not just been told you've been in the margin, but you also place yourself at the margins. And it's a beautiful thing to see God's truth transcend cultures, ethnicities, and nationalities. And we see that through the scriptures. And we see that played out throughout history. And what we have to do, and this is one of my grand challenges to not only people of color, but also folks who are majority culture within this country and who may guard some of the doors, if you will, is that we have to begin to expand the story intentionally, put our place in particular stories and narratives, study, research people who have a different paradigm of the gospel. And because that not only expands the theological understanding of who we are, but it helps expand the theological understanding of people who are different than you. And when you go to a seminary and you read and you study one type of person, when you go to churches and you hear pastors quote from one type of person, when your own personal library is filled with one type of people, then you have a very homogeneous worldview, even if that's not necessarily your primary culture, if you will.
Sure.
And there's great contributions from people of all colors, all nationalities, all backgrounds. And I think the greater we consume that content, the better not only students of the world we are, not only will we love people better and we understand people better, and it'll expand our understanding of God's great manifold wisdom, but it also makes us better people. It also makes us better Christians, and it makes God that much more glorious. Amen. So,
Amen.
yeah, I mean, I think, and it's not just culture. I think also a little bit in my, I think it was the second chapter I try to deal with this, is that it's not just cultural, but I also think it's class and status as well that we have to expand. Like if we're only allowing the stories that come from the palace and not the peasants, then our theology is just really lopsided, and it becomes a social club. And the gospel has never been meant for it to be a social club that was only here to expand our social mobility. It is here to give dignity to all people and a voice to all people.
Awesome. In your book, you touch on a few times about your own faith journey, coming to faith in Christ. And everyone has a different journey that comes at different speeds, and we all kind of mature and deepen our faith in different ways. Can you specifically touch on how your faith journey has impacted and matured your understanding of creativity and vocation?
Yes. So in the book I talk about how so I grew up in California. I had an auntie who worked in Hollywood. My father played professional ball. So I just feel like I was born to be an entertainer. I was born to be a clown, to to just be on somebody's stage and just make a mockery of myself, and et cetera, et cetera. Fast forward many years, I become a Christian. And I think where there was a deficiency in the spaces that I was in, and I find that it wasn't just the spaces that I was in, but this was a ubiquitous kind of deficiency, is that there wasn't a lot of robust and thorough teaching on how to use the skill sets that God gave people outside of the four walls of the church. Like how does someone develop and mature an individual, or help come alongside to mature an individual to be effective in the marketplace, to be effective in the instead of consistently training people to be pastors and missionaries to go to some foreign country, there are a lot of spaces and institutions in this country that can use thoughtful Christians. And if we're constantly just teaching people how to be Bible study advocates or masters of exegeting texts, and then asking them to go to other countries to be missionaries, because that's where the real Christian work is, then what we're doing is we're raising a bunch of immature, ineffective Christians who just go to work to collect checks so that they can give that money back to the church in order to do the real ministry. And when I became a Christian, I knew that primarily the Lord had given me all these gifts, and he'd put me in all these positions, and people loved my talent, and I was charismatic, and I was endearing to folks. But for some reason, I felt like this was inefficient. I was like, well, this is not good for God. Like, God can't do anything with this rapping. God can't do anything with all of it. Until he started to put people in my life that I saw, like the cross movement and other folks that I saw that were doing good work. And I was like, well, maybe there's something that's just inadequate. Like there's an incomplete story being told here. And the other thing was, all the godly people that I was around were adults, better yet, all the godly adults, especially men, were working in full-time ministry. And so sometimes the stories that we take on are not stories that are audibly communicated. They're just implied. And sometimes the messages around us are lived through the lives of people around us. And so because I wasn't exposed to Christians who were doing great work in the marketplace, I said, well, maybe I'm supposed to go into full-time ministry. And so that was a struggle and a tension that I had for many,
Wow.
many years. And but it wasn't until I started, like I said, I wasn't until I started to see people in hip hop, people in Disney, people in the film industry, people who were who weren't afraid of this contagion that a quote unquote that the world had and it was going to jump on them. They were like, no, that the Lord said that I should be of this world, but not I should be in this world, but not of it, and He would protect me, and that I have all the tools, all the resources, and all the tools necessary in order to be efficient for ministry, and I should watch my walk worthy of the calling. And so it's there in the scriptures, and so I just was like, well, I'm going to stumble. I'm going to stumble through the darkness and hopefully find other people who are stumbling through the darkness. And we'll figure this out together.
Mhm. Yeah, and speaking of, just the idea of being in this world but not of the world, you touch on your book about, this idea of like, clean art, right? Just kind of over censoring, right? There's a chapter in your book where there's some colorful language in there. And
Yes.
so I'd love to just hear about, what's the danger for Christians having, an overly sanitized, overly censored sort of life, and what's a good way for us to pursue, understanding this world, but not being of it? How can
Yeah.
we do that?
Oh man, it was one of my favorite chapters because um, I feel as an artist, it just, it really grinds my gears is looking at Christian art and feeling like it is not an accurate depiction of the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I am going to make a movie, let me think about, and I picked on it in the book, and I'm gonna pick on it now. I think like Blind Side. I think I talk about it in the book. I'm not sure. Blind Side, for all intents and purposes, was a pretty good movie, but it could have been much better. It could have been a much better book. Much better. It could have been a much better movie. Very similar. I was in a movie called Grace Card, and I appreciate the people who gave me the opportunity to be in that movie. God bless the folks who contributed. But when I look at that movie, I think that movie could be a much better movie because there's two things that movie deals with. And if we're looking at 2020 and 2021, we see that race is a very prevalent issue in our nation.
Yes.
And the way that they deal with race in those movies is so contrived. It's so trite. It's like there's no niggers, there's no like honkies, there's no strong language. Nobody's calling each other these racial epithets. The way that they resolve the racial tension is quite like putrid. When we talk about conflict in those movies, the conflict is bland. There's no harsh language, and we know that not to be the real world. That is not the world we live in. And that's not only a disservice to the art, that's a disservice to grace. Because if God only dies for a darn and a heck, then that makes grace look extremely cheap. And it makes it seem like, well, God can't redeem the messiness of my life because look at all this Christian, like it's almost you have to be perfect before you even come to the Lord.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
the problem is that when you desensitize the world, you also make Jesus seem as if his grace is not powerful and efficient to save the most wretched and darkest sins in the shadows of our society. And I think the more we actually expose the dark, the more we really talk about the dark, and we show how nasty and vile the dark is when Jesus shows up in the scene or through a form of redemption in whatever art we're talking about, it makes the hallelujah moment that much more glorious. And art, Christian art, is so consumed with the consumer and not the message. And we're more concerned with how do we create a culture that doesn't have, for parents that they don't have to actually castigate or investigate the materials, and so it's just easy, it's family friendly. And look, we need some of that, we need a lot of that, because the other side of this coin is that the world is it flirts with wickedness and vileness in a way that's not honest as well. They don't talk about the dangers of licentiousness, and so we don't want to be flippant with wickedness. We don't want to be um, we don't want to parade and romance the dark, but we also don't want to be ashamed to enter into the dark.
That's really helpful. And I especially am appreciative of understanding a high view of grace when we, understand the darkness. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
Um, one of the things that I think a lot of people might struggle with is they might struggle to see how their vocation, their calling in life, just might seem too insignificant for them to make any sort of actual difference in their community. What kind of practical steps would you advise someone who is kind of stuck in that? They're just thinking, my job or my calling is just too insignificant. I'm not going to do anything big from my job. What kind of practical advice would you give to them to see how God might be using their vocation for good in their community and even rippling beyond that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things, and I think it starts with theology and how we teach. There's two immediate components that I think we need to wrestle with. One is there has to be a better view of what work is in the Christian space. It's not just busy activity. It is actually the contribution of cultivating a world that looks and reflects our Creator. And so many of theologians have said this, and I'll say it. The act of work is worship in itself. It was a task given before there was ever sin. So activity is a part of who humanity is. It's like the fact that we work is a part of who we are. It's the reflection of God's, the first chapter of Genesis is God is working. His identity is I create, like I am a creator. And so therefore I make things, and those things reflect the goodness of who I am. And as God creates us, we are a reflection of that. We are creators, and the creator is the creation that we make is supposed to be a reflection of what we believe and who we are. And hopefully that thing is good, as God said after each thing he created. He says it is good. And so as we work, no matter what we do, I think we should approach it as, man, I am kind of like recapitulating this attribute of God. And hopefully as I do this is good. Like this is something that people will look at and say, that's good. The other component that we need to do is get over this idea of like everything we do has to be world changing. And I think that's the pressure, not only in the way the world talks about and I mean the grand society, the quote unquote secular society, but even the Christian world, we were often talking about impact. We use grandiose words, and the reality of it is some of our work is just a simple contribution that is not grandioso in the sense that it's going to change the world. But guess what? It is changing one or two people's lives. And you're creating some sort of contribution to that person's life that is going to affect them in a way that's going to propel them to some sort of flourishing. And the problem is we're always like Instagram, and we're looking for what's great. Like how can I curate my life in a way that makes it look like I am just doing the most great thing? And we all want platforms. And the reality is we all can't be Einstein. We all can't be, the MLKs and Frederick Douglasses. Like some of us are just people who hold up the arms of Moses, right? Some of us are Aaron's, and some of us are hers. And the problem is we all want to be Moses. And but guess what? Like holding up the arm of a Moses so that we win the war is a huge contribution to the community of God and to society at large. And so I think a better theology of what work is and why your work is important no matter what you do, because it's worship and that's it. The fact that you work is an act of the Lord. And I don't even mean like work in a sense like you have to clock in. I'm talking about activity in general, cultivation from, and I say this in the book, anything from engineers to child rearing, Like you are contributing to an activity. That's why when people don't work, solitary confinement in prisons is supposed to be one of the most heinous things. Like there's nothing to do. You're not contributing. You're not working. You're not doing anything. And then the second thing, like I said, is reevaluating the grandioseness, the grandeur-ness. I don't even know if I'm using that word right, but this idea of being extremely significant in all we do. So, yeah.
That's great. In your book, you mentioned several points in your hip hop career and life as well. Like there's been points where you've had pivots, changes in emphases, and so on. If you could kind of go back in time to yourself when you first started off your career, would you give yourself words of wisdom, just things that now that you wish you would have told yourself?
Absolutely. I'll give myself all the wisdom. I would say, don't start off as a Christian artist. That would be the first thing I would tell. Just be an artist. Just be an artist. And I am not shaming anybody who goes into this wanting to be a Christian, fill in the blank. I just realized that the type of individual I am and the type of engagement that I desire, I probably should have not introduced myself to the world as a Christian hip hop artist. Because once you put that label on you, it's hard to evade it. And then with that, I would have told myself, make the art that you desire to listen to from day one, not the type of music that you think will sell or get you into particular spaces. Make your music, make your art, and be extremely content with that. Those are the two main things that, and then I would also tell myself to start writing a lot sooner, like fiction and nonfiction. Write much sooner. Build your confidence as a writer and a storyteller. I think it's interesting. Like, I think rappers can be. I think there can be a natural transition into literature because of their way with words. And there are a lot of literary devices that you see in Shakespeare that hip hop artists use, but they may not know that they're doing, double entendres and pericopes and all these different things. But peripateos. But the reality of it is that these are literary devices that naturally are being picked up by artists because of how they consume art and music. And they use these devices in ways that you'll find a Milton and all these great writers in the past use it. And the more muscles we build as writers, I think we can become better communicators, not only in hip hop but just in general. And so I would tell myself to write much sooner.
Awesome. The last question I have for you, who are your biggest influences for someone who used their creativity for good, and why are they your biggest influences?
The main person that I always go back to is George Washington Carver. I talked about him in my last chapter. And there's so many reasons why, because he's such an anomaly in the sense that I went to Tuskegee University and he was a professor there and contributed a lot to Tuskegee University. And so I had a grand opportunity of learning a lot about him. So his life is just compelling. But I think about somebody who integrated his faith, science, and art. And he wasn't trying to be this revolutionary, but he was. And I think that's the kind of default, I guess, activist, revolutionary that I think we all can be. Is somebody who doesn't seek to be known as an activist as in the form of their vocation, but everything they do is for the benefit of other people. So I think about George Washington Carver living in Jim Crow, segregated South, but yet and still so many people came to him for his inventions and his patents. Not only for health reasons, not only for economic reasons, but he saved the Southern economy by teaching farmers how to use different types of plants and soils and whatnot. And so, but you cannot separate his great work from his faith. And that's the other element about him that I love, is that his faith was so mysterious in the sense that this man literally used to talk to plants. And he would talk to plants because he believed that that's how he got the secrets of how to of how to grow and contribute. It's a very mystic thing, but I love it because it's quite compelling. And this is why I think when we talk about what does faith look like to certain people, sometimes it's strange, sometimes it's different. And the way that I commune with God may not be the same way in which, you commune with God, Timothy. But and this is why, going back to, I think, your very first question, the beauty of diversity expands who we are and how we live and how we think. If George Washington Carver was all in his to know that his invention, basically, he used his skill sets not just to bless Black people, but to bless all people. And he was a medicinal counselor for Mahatma Gandhi. And so here we even see how people connect in race. I'm not not just racial differences, but in religious differences.
Wow.
And so I think he's a wonderful example of how once we expand our perception of people, we become better human beings, and our work could be of great contribution for the good of society.
Awesome. Well, that's all the questions I have. Do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
I do not. Thank you for having me. I hope you guys enjoy the book.
Yeah, definitely.
And hopefully there'll be some music coming around to partner with the book.
We'd be looking forward to that. Thank you, Sho Baraka, for your time, for writing that book. And we're looking forward to new stuff from you as well.